Welcome to the Hindu Daily. Imagine holding a VIP ticket to a major concert, right? But the date printed on it just says, to be determined.
That sounds incredibly frustrating.
Right. Or, imagine trying to broker global peace while your own house is, well, practically on fire.
Yeah, not the best starting position.
Exactly. So today, for our deep dive, we are looking at the underlying mechanics of leverage. We're going to explore the structural forces shaping everything from, how your political vote is weighed to the high-stakes world of geopolitical negotiations, all the way to the actual physical science of surviving on alien worlds. We've got 5 distinct sources to unpack today.
It's a phenomenal stack of information to sift through, really. And I think the connecting thread for you, the listener, is seeing how power and timing dictate outcomes in these deeply uncertain environments.
Yeah, timing is everything. So let's start with domestic political leverage. Specifically, we're looking at the Nari Shakti Vandanadhiniyam, which is the Women's Reservation Act that was passed back in late 2023.
Right, a very big deal.
Huge deal. The core mechanism of this legislation is historic. I mean, it reserves 1/3 of seats in the Lok Sabha and state assemblies for women, but there was this massive structural caveat attached to it.
The infamous delay.
Exactly. The implementation was officially deferred until after the next census and a subsequent redrawing of constituency boundaries, which is known as delimitation.
And that delay, it originally drew intense criticism from the opposition and women's rights groups because they pushed for it to be rolled out immediately, like for the 2024 elections.
Which makes sense. If you have the law, why wait?
Well, the government's defense at the time was entirely logistical. They essentially said, you cannot implement such a massive structural change to the electoral map without updated demographic data.
Right.
But recent signals indicate a highly deliberate pivot in that strategy. The government is now reportedly considering amending the act to initiate delimitation based on the outdated 2011 census. So completely bypassing the wait for new demographic data.
Wait, really?
Yeah. And concurrently, they're looking at expanding the sheer size of the Lok Sabha by nearly 50%.
Wow.
Taking it from 543 seats up to potentially 816 seats.
But hold on. If we use data from 2011 to redraw the electoral map in 2026, are we intentionally ignoring like 15 years of massive demographic shifts?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Because we've seen rapid urbanization, mass domestic migration, not to mention the entire socioeconomic aftershock of the COVID-19 pandemic. How do you even justify freezing the demographic clock a decade and a half in the past?
Well, you justify it through political calculation. Proceeding with the 2011 data effectively decouples the women's reservation rollout from the upcoming census entirely.
I see where this is going.
Right, because the context here is crucial. The next census is widely expected to include caste enumeration.
Okay.
So by acting before that data is published, the ruling party temporarily sidesteps the intense growing demands for subquotas within the women's reservation, specifically, the demands from other backward classes or OBCs, including Muslim OBC communities.
So by controlling the timeline, they totally control the narrative.
Exactly.
They get to claim credit for delivering this long-pending reform, mobilize women voters for the upcoming state elections in 2024 and 2027, and basically set up a powerful campaign platform for the 2029 general election, all without opening the Pandora's box of caste data.
That's the strategy, yeah.
Yeah.
But the concurrent plan to expand the Lok Sabha from 543 to 816 seats, that introduces an entirely different friction point.
The North-South divide.
Precisely. The demographic divide between northern and southern India. Delimitation based strictly on population inherently amplifies the power of northern states, where fertility rates have remained much higher.
While southern states, conversely, have successfully stabilized their populations.
Right, and they drive a huge chunk of the economy.
So think about what this means for your vote. If you live in a southern state, the sheer mathematical weight of your region's voice in national policy is about to shrink drastically.
Drastically.
Even with a uniform 50% expansion to preserve, like formal proportionality, the absolute seat counts radically shift the balance of power. Uttar Pradesh and Bihar together could approach 180 seats.
Yeah, that's massive.
Meanwhile, the 5 southern states combined Karnataka, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, and Telangana, they might only reach around 195 seats altogether.
And in a first-past-the-post electoral system, raw numerical strength is the ultimate currency. If your region controls fewer seats, your region commands less leverage in passing legislation.
It's just basic math at that point.
Exactly. Furthermore, the legislation leaves another crucial mechanism entirely unresolved, which is the rotation of these reserve constituencies.
Right, because the law doesn't specify if a seat stays reserved for women for multiple terms or if it rotates to a new constituency every single election cycle.
And that uncertainty destroys a politician's incentive to develop their local area.
Oh, because they don't know if they can run there again.
Exactly. If a representative knows their constituency might be reserved for a different demographic in the next cycle and they won't be able to run there, the grassroots motivation to build long-term local patronage networks and infrastructure completely dries up. The structural details determine the functional reality.
So domestic politics clearly relies on calculated timing and, well, the manipulation of leverage. But that same desperate search for leverage is playing out right now on the global stage, in a much more volatile environment. Let's look at the strategic maneuvering of Pakistan's military leadership, specifically Field Marshal Asim Munir.
Munir is currently executing what looks like a textbook case of strategic overreach.
Yeah, his schedule is dizzying.
He has adopted this hyperactive diplomatic schedule, attempting to insert Pakistan into the center of several major global flashpoints.
Right, he's been aggressively wooing the incoming Trump administration, trying to flip, a decade of mutual antipathy. He recently signed a strategic mutual defense agreement with Saudi Arabia. There are reports indicating he's dealing weapons to Libyan warlords and the Sudanese army chief. And most ambitiously, he is trying to position Pakistan as the indispensable mediator between the U.S. or Israel and Iran.
And the mechanism driving all of this isn't just a desire for prestige, right? It's economic desperation.
Because the economy is failing.
Exactly. Munir is trying to monetize this peacemaking role. Pakistan's economy is sclerotic. It's teetering constantly on the edge of default. So by positioning Pakistan's military as this indispensable geopolitical asset, he hopes to secure massive cash bailouts.
I even read there's talk of him trying to formalize an Islamic NATO.
Yes, essentially offering Pakistan's military as the mercenary backbone for Gulf security architectures in exchange for economic lifelines. Ultimately, he wants to elevate his own legacy to surpass Ayub Khan, who is Pakistan's only other field marshal.
But here is my pushback. How does a nation broker peace when it is drowning in its own internal economic and political crises? You can't just declare yourself a global mediator overnight. The leverage has to actually exist.
You're spot on, and the structural realities are already exposing the cracks in that plan. The detractors are watching closely. Well-informed media reports suggest Iran has essentially stopped engaging in these Islamabad-hosted talks.
Wait, really? They just stopped?
Yeah, Tehran likely used the appearance of dialogue merely as a classic misdirection tactic to keep the incoming U.S. administration off balance. They never really viewed Pakistan as a legitimate broker.
So Iran sees through the lack of leverage entirely.
Furthermore, Pakistan is trapped in this irreconcilable contradiction of alliances. They just signed a mutual defense agreement with Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah.
If Saudi Arabia ever triggers that agreement and calls for kinetic military support, Pakistan's illusion of neutrality with Iran vanishes instantly.
Oh, of course. You can't fight Iran's rival and mediate for Iran at the same time.
Exactly. Add to that the sheer unpredictability of the U.S. administration. If Trump decides to declare a sudden nominal victory and just withdraws diplomatic engagement from the region, or, if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, Munir's entire diplomatic house of cards collapses.
Because he simply doesn't control any of the underlying variables.
He doesn't.
So Munir is trying to survive in an incredibly hostile environment by balancing these immense competing pressures. And, surviving under extreme crushing pressure is actually a perfect conceptual bridge to our next topic, which takes us off-world entirely.
Oh, I love this pivot.
We're looking at the cosmic science embedded in Andy Weir's novel, Project Hail Mary.
This is a phenomenal example of using rigorous, real-world astrophysics to construct compelling, biologically accurate science fiction.
We absolutely have to talk about the character Rocky.
Yes, Rocky.
He's this five-limbed, eyeless, rock-like alien who sees using echolocation and communicates through musical chords. And what makes this fascinating is his home system is a real place in our galaxy.
It is.
He hails from 40 Eridani A, which is a star system located 16.34 light-years away. And a fun fact for the sci-fi fans listening, that is the exact same star system that Spock from Star Trek is supposedly from.
It's a really great nod by the author. But the mechanics of Rocky's home planet, Erid, are deeply rooted in hard science. When astrophysicists search for extraterrestrial life, The baseline metric is the habitable zone.
Which is the Goldilocks zone, right?
Exactly. Not hot enough to boil the oceans, not cold enough to freeze them solid. It's the precise orbital distance from a star where conditions allow liquid water to exist on a planet's surface.
Okay, makes sense.
For the star 40 Eridani A, that habitable zone is roughly 101.7 million kilometers away. But in the novel, Rocky's planet, Erid, is situated only 33 million kilometers away from the star.
That's incredibly close.
Very close. It has 8 times the mass of Earth, and its surface temperature is a blistering 210 degrees Celsius.
Okay, but if Erid is sitting at 210 degrees Celsius, shouldn't any liquid water on the surface instantly boil off into steam? That sounds like trying to evolve inside a pressure cooker on maximum heat.
That is exactly what it is. The pressure cooker analogy is the exact physical mechanism that makes Erid habitable.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Think about it. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius on Earth specifically because of our atmospheric pressure at sea level. But Erid possesses an incredibly massive, dense atmosphere composed of ammonia gas.
Ah, so the pressure changes the boiling point.
Exactly. The fundamental physics rule is that higher atmospheric pressure raises the boiling point of liquids. Because Erid's atmosphere exerts such crushing pressure, water physically cannot undergo the phase change into steam. It remains liquid even at 210 degrees.
Wow. So the atmosphere acts as a literal lid on a pressure cooker.
It does.
But being that close to a star creates a secondary, equally lethal problem, doesn't it? The solar radiation and stellar winds at 33 million kilometers should strip that thick ammonia atmosphere away entirely, just leaving the planet barren.
Which means Erid must possess an incredibly strong planetary magnetic field to deflect those stellar winds, much like how Venus maintains its thick atmosphere in our own solar system.
This is fascinating.
And this brings us to the most brilliant part, how the physics dictate the biology. Because this ammonia atmosphere is so unfathomably dense, zero sunlight penetrates to the surface. It is pitch black.
So that's why he doesn't have eyes.
Precisely. The evolutionary path on Erid had no use for sight, so the Iridians evolved echolocation instead. The hostile environment engineered their exact physical form.
The math checks out beautifully. And the novel also introduces another alien organism, the astrophage, which is essentially this invasive species of space algae that consumes stellar energy.
Right, the catalyst for the whole plot.
Yeah, in the story, it threatens to plunge Earth into a global ice age by dimming our sun. Though obviously this relies on a totally fictional physics concept called super cross-sectionality to explain how a tiny microbe can store star-level energy.
Right, that is where the fiction does the heavy lifting, giving the characters an existential climate catastrophe to solve.
So in fiction, we have an organism threatening to trigger a global climate catastrophe. But here in reality, we are fighting our own climate crisis. The physics of atmospheric pressure saved the fictional Iridians, but our changing atmospheric chemistry is forcing us into these highly complex, incredibly expensive economic corners.
It really is.
Which brings us to the harsh realities of India's newly revised climate strategy.
Yes, we are looking at India's nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which were submitted as part of the Paris Agreement. And the new targets are quite aggressive on paper.
Yeah, let me lay these out. India is committing to reducing the emissions intensity of its GDP to 47% below 2005 levels by 2035. They aim to achieve 60% non-fossil fuel installed capacity for power generation, and they plan to create a massive carbon sink capable of absorbing 3.5 to 4 billion tons of carbon.
Those are substantial pledges. However, some international observers have looked at these NDCs and labeled them a walk in the park.
A walk in the park.
Yeah, implying that India's targets are too conservative and easily achievable. But that critique completely ignores the hidden, staggering transition costs of integrating renewable energy at a national scale.
Because it's not cheap.
Not at all. You have to contextualize this through India's structural reality as a lower middle-income country, where cheap thermal coal is the historical baseline for energy.
Right. And integrating 60% renewable capacity isn't just about throwing up more solar panels. You run into the massive physics problem of grid balancing.
Grid balancing is the true bottleneck here. The power grid must perfectly match supply and demand in real time. When you rely heavily on solar and wind, you introduce massive intermittency, the sun sets or the wind stops blowing.
And the grid still needs power.
Exactly. So to keep the grid from collapsing, you need utility-scale battery storage, the scaling of which will cost trillions of rupees. Alternatively, you have to keep thermal coal plants running in the background just to ramp up when renewables drop off.
And when the sun is shining at peak hours, You actively have to instruct those cheaper, readily available coal plants to power down.
Yes.
So you're intentionally choosing a more expensive, technically difficult operational path simply to sustain your climate commitments.
Precisely. Now, people often point to pumped hydro storage as the magic solution to grid balancing, pumping water uphill when energy is abundant and letting it flow through turbines when energy is needed.
Sounds like a great workaround.
On paper, yes. But in India, pumped hydro faces severe structural constraints. You encounter massive environmental pushback regarding deforestation, complex regulatory hurdles, and direct competition for water resources, particularly from an agricultural sector that desperately needs that water for irrigation.
Okay, I understand the internal constraints.
Yeah.
But critics argue we must do more to hit that 1.5-degree global warming limit. It's an existential imperative. If developing nations just point to their structural constraints to justify utilizing coal, aren't we essentially just pointing fingers at historical emitters while the ship sinks for everyone?
It is less about pointing fingers and more about hedging a developmental future. This is the core of climate justice. India's per capita emissions currently stand at only 1/3 of the global average.
Right, which is quite low.
You cannot demand that a developing nation sacrifice its crucial manufacturing growth, its ability to provide basic goods, and its ongoing urban transition just to compensate for the historical carbon debt accrued by massive industrialized nations.
Especially when the largest historical emitter, the United States, has previously demonstrated a willingness to walk out of international climate treaties entirely when it suited their domestic politics.
Exactly. India's NDCs are deeply strategic and legally aligned with the Paris Agreement, which explicitly allows targets to be based on national circumstances. If India slashes its own development to drastically cut emissions, the marginal global benefits of that reduction are mostly absorbed by the heavy emitters who still refuse to do their fair share. It is a deeply asymmetrical playing field.
This tension balancing fairness, historical grievances, and urgent existential crises is exactly why international agreements of any kind are so notoriously fragile.
They are incredibly difficult to maintain.
It requires masterful negotiation and leverage to force a deal. Which brings us to our final source, looking at the actual academic architecture of global conflict mediation.
We touched on this earlier when discussing Pakistan's attempts to mediate in the Middle East. True mediation is not just about hosting a summit or shaking hands for the cameras.
Right. Beyond two diplomats sitting at a table, what is the actual mechanism that makes mediation succeed?
There is a robust academic and legal framework dictating why certain conflicts end and others don't. Let's look at the foundational academic frameworks. Jacob Berkovich developed the contingency model.
And what does that entail?
It argues that mediation success relies on a specific matrix: the credibility of the mediator, their unique leverage, and the inherent nature of the dispute. Then you also have William Zartman's theory of ripeness.
The theory of ripeness. So that suggests a conflict has to be ready to be picked, much like fruit, before anyone will actually compromise.
Exactly. Zartman's core argument is that warring parties will only genuinely negotiate when they reach what he terms a mutually hurting stalemate.
A mutually hurting stalemate.
Yes, this means both sides are losing so heavily, and the financial, political, or human pain of continuing the conflict finally outweighs the pain of making concessions.
Do we have a historical example of that?
A classic historical example is the 1979 Lancaster House Agreement, which ended the Rhodesian-Bush War and led to Zimbabwe's independence. All parties had fought to an absolute bloody standstill. The stalemate was destroying everyone involved, so they were finally forced to the table. And note there is a legal bedrock here, too, like the Hague Conventions and UN Charter Chapter 6, Article 33.
So we often operate under the assumption that a mediator needs to be a perfectly neutral referee, like an actor with zero stake in the outcome. Is that actually true in high-stakes geopolitics?
Surprisingly, no. In reality, academic theory largely challenges that assumption through the concept of biased mediation.
Biased mediation.
Yes. Sometimes raw power and economic leverage matter far more than perceived neutrality. Consider the 1978 Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. The United States was absolutely not a neutral referee.
Definitely not.
But the U.S. wielded immense geopolitical power, military leverage, and the economic capacity to offer massive financial incentives to both sides to force an agreement. Their overt bias was entirely eclipsed by their overwhelming leverage.
Okay, so applying this academic framework back to our earlier discussion about Iran, this explains exactly why Pakistan's mediation attempts are failing. Pakistan does not possess that leverage.
Exactly.
Their economy is on life support, and their strategic ties to the U.S. and Saudi Arabia obliterate their credibility in Tehran. They simply lack the tools to force a mutually hurting stalemate to an end.
Which is why geopolitical analysts point to China as a vastly stronger candidate for mediation in the West Asian conflict.
Because they have the leverage.
Look at the mechanisms of their leverage. China is a massive buyer of Iranian oil. They have deep systemic economic investments across the region, and they already proved their capacity by successfully brokering the 2023 diplomatic normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Right, China actually holds the economic carrots and sticks required to make both sides listen. They have the financial and diplomatic leverage necessary to take a mutually hurting stalemate and engineer a concrete resolution, whereas a less influential actor like Pakistan is just hosting a venue for dialogue without the power to enforce an outcome.
The mechanics of power and timing remain universal. Whether you are utilizing a 2011 census to redraw a domestic political map, leveraging oil purchases to broker peace in the Middle East, or relying on atmospheric pressure to survive on a planet 16 light years away.
It all comes down to having the right leverage at the exact right time. So the question for you to mull over today is this. In your own life and work, are you making structural decisions based on outdated data from 2011, or are you waiting until you hit a mutually hurting stalemate before you finally sit down and negotiate a necessary change? Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.